of time, so thank you.
Okay, so just to say, we haven't got that many slides, and we're going to use this. We haven't used it before, it's a bit of a test. But if you've got any thoughts or questions as we go along, you can just tweet them, or well, it's like tweeting on your phone, and they appear up there, and then we can address them at the end. Is that okay? By the magic, I don't know how it works, it just works. So if you go to menti.com, put in that code, then you can comment as we go, ask questions as we go. That's fine. Okay. So we're here to talk today about radical pedagogy in higher education institutions, and specifically for us, the challenge of raising critical consciousness from a place of white privilege. So my name is Hayley Douglas, this is Jess Achilleos, and we are both senior lecturers in youth and community work at Wrexham Glyndŵr University. We are both JNC professionally qualified youth workers, we are both still in practice, and yes, you guessed it, we're both white, and we're both women, and the assumption that we are both middle class is also right. Youth and community work is underpinned by the principle of anti-oppressive practice. This involves the recognition that society is fundamentally unjust, structural and institutional oppression creates inequality, and therefore there is a need to work towards the equitable distribution of opportunity, privilege and wealth across society. Developing an understanding of the processes by which oppression occurs and is maintained is key to anti-oppressive practice, and only by taking a critical stance can these distortions be uncovered.
So, whilst a simple operational definition of youth work is not possible due to changes in social and political context, role, institution and funding, an early definition offered by Butters and Newell still captures the essence of youth work as a countervailing force against the reproduction of social inequalities which formal education magnifies. For Butters and Newell, there are 5 foci of youth work, including character building, cultural adjustment, community development, institutional reform, and the radical paradigm of self-emancipation. For Smith, however, 20th century youth work is best described as a process of informal education, valuing the voluntary relationship between youth worker and young people, promoting association and experiential learning, but also importantly raising critical consciousness, to empower and promote participation in democratic processes to bring about social change. However, to become an anti-oppressive practitioner, there is a requirement to first understand your own identity, personal values and prejudices before you engage in the informal educational process with others. For Freire, this involves developing our own critical capacity, curiosity and rigour, as well as the young people or students that we're working with.
So before starting on my own youth and community work education here at Montfort over 10 years ago, I assumed that because I wasn't mean to black people, because I didn't see race as an issue and because I treated everybody the same, that I was not racist. However, through the education process and critical reflection, I became aware of my own white privilege. As Edo Lodge eloquently explains white privilege, I recognise that my white skin will positively impact on my life's trajectory, that this was happening without me even noticing it, and that my experiences as a white person were actually not the norm for everybody else. As McIntosh points out from her position of white privilege and her white perspective, I was aware that racism puts others at disadvantage, but I was unaware of the visible package of unearned assets and advantages afforded by my own whiteness. So acknowledging our white privilege also makes us accountable. It allows us to recognise our own unconscious oppression, but should also lead to challenge of the structural oppression that causes racism in the first place.
For Bhopal, white privilege is a fundamentally structural arrangement that affords undue advantages to the expressions of whiteness through the maintenance of power, resources, accolades and systems of support through formal and informal structures and procedures. Racism continues to disadvantage those from BAME groups in formal educational institutes, schools and higher education. Pilkington argues that 20 years on from the Macpherson report, the problem of institutional racism still abounds. Yet focus seems to have shifted to other protected characteristics, and so to social and economic forms of oppression in higher education institutes. While celebrating diversity and promoting equality should be commended, this could mean that equality for BAME groups is taken for granted rather than remaining in the consciousness of the institutions, which may discriminate through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racial stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. Statistics show that 18% of UK students identified as BAME in 2016-17. For institutions where geographic populations have small numbers of BAME groups, there is a greater but more important challenge in raising the critical consciousness of white privileged students, especially for those programmes whose aim to promote and educate anti-oppressive practitioners. The last census shows that the population of Wales is 94% white British. Figures for Glyndŵr show that the proportion of BAME students has increased from 3.7% to 6%, with an increase of BAME staff to 10%. However, increasing diversity in the institution continues to be challenged by our demographics. As white privileged academics working in the patriarchal system of higher education, we are presented with a conundrum. How do we create the space for radical pedagogy to raise critical consciousness in our academic roles and the wider profession, especially ensuring that our students are aware of their own white privilege and go out into youth work practice to challenge structural oppression and inequality rather than reinforce it?
So Johnson argues that a primary obstacle preventing an understanding of racism as a form of systemic oppression is the dominance of the white racial frame. Students' viewpoints, emotions and ideologies are rooted in this, shaping actions and thinking in everyday situations to rationalise racial hierarchy. But often they're unaware of this, and Bonilla Silva supports this by stating that students are cautious of discussing race and use colourblind frames of reference to minimise the salience of racism, and this presents an immediate challenge when teaching about race, especially when the diversity in the classroom leads to students not wanting to engage in discussions in case they offend. Although the youth and community work programmes are more diverse than many others at Wrexham Glyndŵr University, Mackintosh's assertion stands that many and perhaps most of our white students think that racism doesn't affect them because they're not people of colour. They do not see their whiteness as a racial identity. Adopting a radical pedagogy therefore encourages students to not only understand the concept of white privilege, but acknowledge their own privilege and doing the formal educational process of teaching people not to see the invisible systems that confer racial dominance. So in order to challenge racism, a pedagogy is required that goes beyond the teaching of concepts to help students developing competing frames of reference that do more than critique and promote an alternative understanding of reality.
Okay, so initial conversations with students often leads to assertions of reverse racism and then to perceived white victimhood. This is particularly the case with our students who are overwhelmingly from widening participation groups that have faced other forms of oppression due to poverty, disability, sexuality and gender, and do not regard themselves as being privileged in any way. But being taught not to see difference results in a failure to explore bias, and the challenges to this position result in defensive actions. Zinger and Stiers also found similar reactions to aspects of their curriculum that triggered and provoked various aspects of resistance in the face of anti-oppressive pedagogy. However, there is a need to make space for conflict and emotion so that personal prejudice and structural racism can be deconstructed by students and ourselves. Specific examples that we need to critically analyse in terms of youth and community work practice include, but are not limited to, a critical analysis of what Butters and Newell term as cultural adjustment, and ensuring that this does not turn into making people more like us. This is especially the case as Young asserts that the purpose of youth work is to support young people's personal and social development, engaging young people during adolescence at a point when identity is formed, helping them to question their identity and role in the world. Therefore, supporting young people to explore their racial identity, creating critical consciousness around structural forms of oppression, and empowering young people to challenge this is crucial to youth work. A further area of consideration is the aspect of white culture that provides the unspoken definition of acceptable emotions to share within the workplace, sometimes described as professionalism. This has particularly come to the forefront in terms of white students undertaking work placements in the Gambia and BAME organisations in the UK, and then consequently raising differing cultural norms as unprofessional practice in the workplace.
So in order to challenge this, Galati Party and Potterchuk recommend creating a container with intentional group norms, exploring accumulated advantage and disadvantage, and reflecting on white culture. As Bhopal asserts, there is also a need to move away from Eurocentric curriculum, which contributes to the normalisation of whiteness. At times, our own teaching is guilty of relying on the words and thoughts of too many old dead white guys. But any work that makes whiteness visible must weaken its power. So opening up classrooms to create safe spaces where students and educators can critically reflect on their own positionality is fundamental. Youth and community work education, adopting a radical pedagogical approach in our own classrooms may be one such container in which we can offer this challenge. It's also important to define what the parameters of radical pedagogy are. Fedotova and Nikoleva discuss the difference between education that can and should be orientated towards radical social change, as per the influences of Freire and Giroux, and new techniques for teaching and learning that fall outside of mainstream pedagogy, often utilised in formal education. And to this end, the Youth and Community Work Programme adopts a philosophy of education that incorporates both radical pedagogy as a theoretical concept, but also as alternative educational practice to challenge oppression and encourage and nurture anti-oppressive practice. As Belton asserts, the role of radical youth work is not to claim that we are experts with a narrow specialist knowledge of youth work, but to use our intellect instead to question received ideas and apparent understanding, specifically in an effort to break down stereotypes and reductive categories that limit human thought and communication. Our role is acknowledging our white privilege. Our role in acknowledging our white privilege is, as Carmichael and Hamilton state, to ask the right questions, to encourage a new consciousness, and to suggest new forms to express it. Critical reflection, dialogue, and questioning becomes tools of the educator.
Smith argues that there is no simple anti-oppression formula that we can follow. We are in a constant state of trial and error and radical experimentation. Bell et al. Highlight the personal and intellectual challenges facing educators in the classroom when addressing social justice issues. Hook summarises our sentiment that at times the fear of losing control in the classroom leads educators to fall into conventional teaching patterns where power is used destructively. This is reflective of our position on the youth and community programmes at Wrexham Glyndŵr University, and therefore we seek suggestions from our audience here in how we can raise the critical consciousness of our white privileged students, as well as ensuring that we deconstruct unseen and unintended oppression. Thank you.